Okay. So let me now fast forward to 2013. What happened in 2013? Well, end of 2012, like middle of 2012, there was an election, federal election in Mexico, which saw, as we know, Mexico has a change of presidency every 6 years, and the actual president cannot rerun for presidency again. So basically you have 6 years of blocks where you get what are known as sexenios in Mexico. And what happened curiously was the following. First, between 1929 and 2000, the same party ruled Mexico year after year, or sexenio after sexenio, for a very, very long time. And it was so much so that Mario Vargas Llosa, the Peruvian author, has termed, or had termed, the Mexican ruler as the perfect dictatorship in the world. So basically, there was democracy, but there was no real democracy, according to him. And that has been subscribed to by lots of other people as well. And however, in 2000, the ruling party was defeated soundly, and opposition took over, and they ruled for the next 12 years. The Mexican candidate, Enrique Peña Nieto, at that time, came up with a series of proposals that he said if he becomes the president, he's going to implement those things to implement for the Mexican federal government. Although he came into power with 38% of the popular votes, nevertheless, since this is a first past the post election and no second round, that was it. He became the president. And it also affected the way the parties voted. So basically Mexico has three main parties. They are called PRI, PAN and PRD. So if you look at how many seats they have, there's an upper house, there's a lower house. The major party for which Enrique Peña Nieto was a candidate, they have 240 seats with the Green Party. And the opposition, two other oppositions, PRD has 136 and PAN has 114. It's important to remember that PAN was the party which ruled for the 12 years. So they became, during their rule, they became very, very unpopular. On the other hand, in the upper house, in the Senate, PRI has close to majority, but not quite. PAN and PRD split the rest of the votes. So you basically have three different parties are controlling sizable blocks of seats in both the upper house and in the lower house. What that meant was the following. For PRI, it became impossible to run as they did before, when they actually had absolute majority in both the House and the Senate. It became impossible for them to run the country the way they did before. So they had to compromise. And as a result, what they did was they set out a set of proposals where they went around and actually soliciting the opposition to help them pass this agenda. And that became known as the Compromiso para México, or Promises to Mexico. The promises was unilateral declaration. They said, we are going to do these things if we come to power. And then, when they went around soliciting the opposition for supporting their cause, they came up with what has become known as Pact for Mexico, or El Pacto. So basically, El Pacto, what it does is an implicit understanding between parties, whoever agrees, to support whatever proposal to change policies by the Mexican president. And at first, all three parties signed into this. And this is something very, very unprecedented. Over the previous 12 years, they were all at loggerheads, and there has never been any agreement for anything by all three parties. This was the first time that happened. So what kind of proposal did they come up with? They came up with a huge list. It's about 90 odd proposals. The important ones came in the form of educational reform, tax reform, reform of the political process, for the oil market, labor market, pension, and telecommunication. Let me talk about each of these things in brief. First, why education? If we look at the OECD countries, and typically you look at benchmark like PISA score and so on, Mexico always comes out first, but from the bottom. Usually the Turks also come in the same neighborhood, but those are always at the bottom of any of the OECD lists, which is not very surprising because OECD is really a club of rich countries, and Mexico is not yet there, neither is Turkey. But if we compare the PISA score of Mexico with some other countries in the region, Mexico is not all that worse. It comes better than Brazil, but of course it comes worse than Chile, not by much. So education was seen to be an important element for Mexico to graduate to the rich man's club. And to give you a summary of what Mexican education system is like, Mexican school system, we are talking about year 0 to year 12, is dominated by the teachers union, and in fact there's a lot of evidence that the positions of teachers or teacher equivalents were actually sold in the market to the highest bidder. And when the teachers went on strike, it had no consequence. And in fact, we did not even know how many schools are there in Mexico. They did the first census of Mexican schools recently and found there were 540 schools which were ghost schools, as they call it, fantasmas. The schools' names are there, but the schools actually do not exist. So when the reform was passed, it basically said it's going to reward the teachers who do well, and for good measure, the person who was the head of the union was thrown in jail, and the teachers who go on strike, now they will have their salary reduced, and the first ever census of Mexican schools have taken place. The results will be out soon. Then there was a tax reform. Basically, the tax reform did not, it had a lot of things that they were planning to do, but eventually none of the parties supported it, including some of the deputies of their own party. So it ended up raising taxes on the wealthiest, and there are new taxes on sugar-added drinks, the so-called junk food tax, and then there's new taxes on capital gains, and the frontier states which have enjoyed reduction in IVA or VAT will have theirs raised as well. So basically, it is seen as a punishment for the border states, but we'll see whether that really has any impact or not. And there are some new initiatives trying to get the formal sector expanded by reducing the informal sector. As we know, more than half of the labor force in Mexico work in the informal sector, so this is a very important task. However, the tax reform that proposes to do so, it really falls short of how this should be done. So we're not very optimistic about this is really going to bring home the bacon. There has also been labor market reform. It has become now easier to hire and fire workers, and it also increased the flexibility for the employers. It has reduced the power of the unions, and reduce the cost of labor, of formal labor in the formal sector. When you ask the employers, obviously they'll see this as a good thing. When you ask the workers, obviously they see this as a very bad thing. On the political front, there has been a very big set of changes on political processes. For example, now re-election of politicians has become possible, which was not before. Previously, independent candidates could not run for anything. Now it has become possible, and they should be made accountable in some ways or the other by these things. So if you have an incentive to get re-elected, you have to perform. Until now, this has not been the case. Once you are elected, well, then you can do whatever you want to do. But there are elements in this whole thing that has been proposed that are less than desirable. So, for example, if a winning party spends more than what is stipulated by law, the win can be challenged. However, if the difference between the votes is more than 5%, then it cannot be challenged anymore. Which is kind of gives you perverse incentives to spend a lot of money and win by a very big margin. That way, doesn't matter how you spend the money, you will not get any penalty whatsoever. So there are some worrying features of this process, but generally it is seen to be a good thing. Now let me talk a little bit about the oil production process. If we look at Mexican oil production, then the picture looks like this. This is again a picture from 1950 to 2012. In 1950, Mexico was producing less than 400,000 barrels per day. In the 1970s, new oil fields were discovered, and that really jacked up the production by fivefold, and Mexico saw a tremendous increase of oil production in the 1970s. However, when we came to 1981, along with general malaise of Mexican economy, oil production was also hit. Part of the same reason, oil prices fell globally, and Mexican exports were not bringing in as much money as it used to. So 1981 and 81-82 was a turning point where we see the Mexican oil production leveling off. And you see the similar sort of thing with the export picture. It had gone up a bit in the early 2000s, but again, from 2004 onwards, there has been a market decline in Mexican oil production. So that has gotten people worried about a lot of things. So next thing what we're going to talk about is about the oil business in Mexico.